Module 7, Psychology of Consciousness. Another exciting week, hopefully. I know that a lot of you have asked questions about the midterm and final project. I'll be happy to continue answering the questions that you asked via email as well as in the comments. But all the required structure, content, focus of the final project is to be found in the first module on Canvas. So if you would like to reach out to me, again, please do that at any time. But I want to re-emphasize this. The final project should be something that you are interested in, that preferably will be connected to what we discuss in class, but can also expand upon the topics that we explore. For the simple reason that psychology of consciousness is such a broad area of analysis that I really want you to explore what it means for you on a daily basis in your everyday life or in terms of your life philosophy to study consciousness from a psychological and neuroscientific standpoint. So I'll start this lecture, but please know that I'm always here for you to clarify some of the areas that might not be clear. So week 7, it is technically the midterm, because it's a 14/15 week course. I say slash because I always like to leave the very last week for the celebration of successes. So as we embark on week 7, please try to take some time for yourself and see what you were more interested in so far. And also keep in mind that we'll keep building up the scientific knowledge on the premises and theoretical assumptions that we encountered. Now, today, I would like to further continue our discussion, although in a more pragmatic way, perhaps. Last week, there were a lot of animations in the video. This week, I'd like to stick to the more old school slides. So that's what we're going to do next. And there are several ways to discuss the topic that we will see today. Perhaps an encounter with the transcendental element of our nature, an encounter with the divine, an encounter with some elements of, we could say, paranormal studies. And I say that with some element of scientific suspiciousness, simply because very often when we talk about the paranormal, the tendency is to either completely disregard it as anti-scientific or the opposite, which is as risky, to embrace it simply because it seems to give us some sense of nurturing transcendental knowledge, which is also not good. So today, I would like to start with the slides, and I will share some names of famous researchers, scientists that study the psychology of consciousness, also from a paranormal, transcendental aspect, and yet utilizing all the parameters of the scientific method in the lab, which is extremely important. Now, today we will not making the claim that everything has to be studied in the lab, but at the very least, if something is studied in a scientific sense, then we can have more of a assurance, if not 100% aiming at the closest to truth, assurance that what we are discovering is very, very basic in our understanding of science so far. Now, let's begin with the first slide that asks a big question. So correlation between fields, science and transcendence. Already here we are asking the question of, are these two separate fields? Should they even communicate? Should we consider them from a philosophical standpoint? Or are we embarking on something that in itself is not scientific? Well, I think a good way to start a conversation is to consider them to be separate areas of investigations, at the very least, so that we don't make the mistake of forcing one perspective on the other. So science, so far as knowledge predicated upon the utilization of the scientific method, empirical knowledge, we could say, certainly not only positivist or scientistic knowledge, but definitely knowledge that is based on empirical sciences, on experimentation, on lab work, on meta-analysis. And then what is a transcendental element? I already mentioned in the past that there are different ways to discuss what transcendence is, but something that transcends is really something that goes beyond what we can observe, right? And we can observe with our senses or with utilization of the technology that we previously discussed, for instance, neuroimaging. Now, transcendence in this sense could also be viewed as para-scientific or para-systematic, even paranormal, where para is intended to be something that goes beyond, that goes transcending, going passing the limits of the scientific understanding. So if we consider transcendence in that sense, obviously this seems to be in juxtaposition to the scientific method we use in an empirical sense. Empirical as in observable with the technology, the tools that we have in science, transcendence in terms of what we can perceive with other ways of investigation. And this opens up a new question: is transcendent and transcendental the same, or should we view these two adjectives in different ways? Well, a good way to think of the distinction is thinking about the history, and specifically the history of philosophy, and even more specifically, the way the term was used by Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher. Now, that said, we could always view transcendence as the term for something that goes beyond in general. Some people will interpret that in a more spiritual sense, some people in a more philosophical sense, others in a religious, cultural, or ethno-religious cultural sense. But we will see how that can be interpreted and understood by combining the scientific method and philosophy. In the first image here, you see the circadian rhythm. We explore the relevance of body functions on perception, awareness, and health. The circadian rhythm is essential for the maintenance of mind-body balance, more specifically for neural hormone levels, sleep and wakefulness, blood pressure, body temperature, and etc., etc.
So we talked about this in the past, recent past, in the last few weeks. And of course, there are more than one circadian rhythm. In general, by circadian, we do mean the 24-hour clock. But then you probably heard of diurnal rhythm, which is simply night and day, which is, kind of a similar perspective. The ultradian, which is less than 24 hours, and infradian, circalunar, which again comes from the circa, Latin for approximately, almost, and luna, which means moon. And this is connected, of course, to the 28-day period. Now, as far as circadian rhythm, the research in consciousness is really, really broad. So, as I mentioned before, we have a few researchers and scientists that I cited in this lecture. But the most important thing, if you look at the image here, is to understand the role of melatonin, which is really the sleep hormone. And this varies on a individual level, but overall, between, let's say, 10 p.m. and 10:30, that's where the secretion starts to be more intense. And of course, overall, melatonin rises about an hour later in teens than in adults. So those things do vary also based on age and lifestyle. Then you do have these ups and downs of energy, which we already viewed before. And the research is pretty consistent. There's one research, just to give you an example, by Jeffrey Hall, Michael Rosbach, and Michael Young. It's one of the most famous research because they won the Nobel Prize in 2017 for that. What they did, they studied fruit flies, which have a similar genetic makeup to us. And what they did, they isolated a gene that helps control the circadian rhythm. So Hall, Rosbach, and Young showed that this gene produces a protein that builds up in cells overnight and then breaks down in daytime. This process will, of course, be related to sleep patterns and how more precise, cognitively sharp the brain functions are. And this is something that's really connecting the cycle itself with the chemistry. Now, if the question is there anything else related to chemistry and the scientific background of the sleep factor? Well, you have to keep in mind that there are mutations in certain genes that could affect our biological clocks. I mentioned before external factors. So hormone release itself from a chemical standpoint, but also everything else associated to the digestive process, eating habits, etc. No, also because we mentioned the more basic functions of that brain area, also body temperature, and external factors such as blue light, I mentioned this before going to bed, change of shift, lifestyle changes, jet lag, all of these can confuse our biological clock. So this is really important to understand in general. And if the question is, what is a healthy circadian rhythm? Again, try to follow a fairly regular sleep day schedule between 7 and 9 hours. There's a bit of the room there. Now, more things about the neuroscientific components. If you do remember that the circadian, how can we call this, control feature, the pacemaker, is the SCN in the hypothalamus, the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And what happens, yet again, is this transient consciousness. So we mentioned transcendental, and this is really the scientific view of how the body is in transition between day and night. So as the body transitions, the body sends inputs to the retinohypothalamic pineal pathway. You should remember the pineal gland because of our discussion on René Descartes, on Cartesius, and the role of the pineal gland as the center of consciousness, right? One hypothesized center of consciousness and the soul in a broader sense. Not to be confused with the pituitary gland, which is still considered a master gland, despite the fact that it's still connected to the thalamic structure, hypothalamus, thalamus, and hypothalamus. In any case, when it's daytime, during these light cycles, the axons from the retinal ganglionic cells deliver signals that activate this nucleus, the SCN, via cranial nerve 2, which is the optic nerve. You should go back to last week's image just to follow the brain diagram. But in any case, the SCN then delivers the signals with the inhibitory neurotransmitter GABA. If you think of GABA, this neurotransmitter, gamma aminobutyric acid, think of it as, I don't know, gabbing away a boring political speech like GABA, 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 GABA. GABA has to do with inhibition, right? With calming down, with controlling, right? And the GABA inhibits the paraventricular nucleus. Now, these axons eventually will send impulses through the intermediate lateral column to inhibit the superior cervical ganglion, thus inhibiting the sympathetic nervous system. Again, I'm not expecting you to remember this by heart, but I want you to understand that it's a very precise scientific way to interpret the transition of consciousness in this sense. So if you study psychology of consciousness, you could at the very least follow the patterns. We follow the patterns in terms of action potentials on their own. We talked about the chemistry in general, what type of chemicals are involved, and now we combine these things so you can see both from a mechanical standpoint, right, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the hypothalamus, the retinohypothalamic pineal pathway, the cranial nerve 2, which is the optic nerve, the neurotransmitter GABA, the paraventricular nucleus. You can really physically follow it. It's not just philosophy. You can follow what's happening. And then you also monitor this, let me use this term, intelligent design. I know that this is a very controversial term. Very often, intelligent design is confused with things such as, I don't know, young Earth creationism, which as scientists we cannot support. It does not make sense with the current scientific knowledge, and so we should reject unless there's something major, catastrophically changing all our understanding. But this has nothing to do with Earth, young Earth creationism, the assumption that the Earth is like 5,000 years old or something like that, due to, I don't know, misunderstood hyper-religious perspective. This is not true from a scientific standpoint. But intelligent design in itself is a term that in the US it's somewhat charged. But in general, from the perspective of the broader scientific community, simply means combining function and structure. So if you study consciousness, you look at the brain, and you see that the function and structure makes perfect sense. And this is one of such examples. So if all these sequences, okay, from the suprachiasmatic nucleus all the way to the superior ciliary ganglion, but the ultimate result is that the melatonin does not get released from the pineal gland into circulation during daytime. So the brain knows it, okay? Now, this knowledge we could call physical consciousness as far as this type of photo perception, okay, the perception of light and images, we could say. But then when we have the full transition, so when we go from daytime to nighttime, the departure of light signals, so the departure of light itself, the fact that the light is fading, this in itself is an intelligent signal to what? To the retinal ganglion cell, which eventually will stop, will control, will inhibit the SCN, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the activating elements of the paraventricular nucleus, and the paraventricular nucleus will send axons through the intermediolateral nucleus, or IML, to the superior cervical ganglion, eventually stimulating the sympathetic nervous system. If you remember that, the sympathetic nervous system is the gas pedal, the accelerator of a car. But in this sense, in this specific example, the sympathetic nervous system acts as an accelerator, as an activator, but to activate what? Sleepiness. So this is a perfect example of what I was sharing in week 1 and 2 when we talked about the relation between the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system. If you remember, I said the sympathetic nervous system is somewhat like a plus activation, and the parasympathetic nervous system, if you remember, parachute, it calms the system down. But in this case, it seems to be the opposite, right? Wait a second. Wasn't the sympathetic nervous system the one that's supposed to wake us up? And now you're telling us that it will induce sleepiness. And the answer to this question is no, it activates the sleepiness process, okay? So the superior cervical ganglion will stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, which will induce sleepiness. So this is a really good way to understand it. To some extent, similar to what we said about operant conditioning, that we should not confuse punishment with a negative element with plus and minus. So it's important not to confuse these things. But in any case, the ultimate result of all I'm saying here is that the pineal gland eventually is mobilized to secrete melatonin into circulation at night. Okay, so it stops during the day. Okay, so you're not falling asleep during the day, and then it will start secreting melatonin at night. Okay, so and this is very, very important yet again because it's responding to our internal state of affair, our internal consciousness, biological consciousness, a body intelligence, you could say, right? As well as what's going on outside of us, an intelligence of the environment we are in. We are part of nature. So there's a relationship between physiological cues and behavioral cues. When you go to sleep, what type of lifestyle you have, your meals, your social interaction, okay? Whether you're in love or not, okay? What type of hormones, hormonal structure you have at that time, okay? What kind of levels, okay? And everything is connected. Fluctuation in body temperature, right? They occur systematically during this cycle. And this is also connected to stress. So if you study consciousness, you understand that stress plays a very important role as well. How? Well, because under the control of the SCN, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the cortisol secretion is rhythmic, also via the paraventricular nucleus, the hypothalamus. So what happens is that the overproduction of cortisol can inhibit your ability to induce sleep. So you're stressed, you're overworked, and yet you cannot fall asleep, right? So this is very important how that manifests itself. It's about finding balance, okay? So, and not only that, but every time we talk about mental health, if you study consciousness, the likelihood you are also interested in the psychology of self in terms of mood and perhaps happiness, meaning and purpose of life, and even depression is most likely high, right? So more and more research actually indicates that there is a very strong link between the circadian rhythmic structure, the rhythm itself, and mood regulation disorders, for instance, SAD or seasonal affective disorder. Okay, so uh, these also disrupt the biochemical component of the circadian rhythm, especially if you don't have sun exposure. But everything else is as important, your lifestyle in general. All right, so let's continue. The next slide asks a question: where did this all come from? Is our consciousness a product of our brains, or is the brain more like a receptor, an antenna through which we filter perception, cognition, emotion, action, and overall information? Now, there's something I would like you to bring home from this course. We are on week 7, so we are halfway through the semester. Is this: not everything can be studied scientifically in terms of laboratory science, but we should always strive for that approximation to scientific truth. Yes, it's also not necessarily true that everything is dependent on the brain. And you might have heard some studies indicating that you have other type of brain-like functions and perhaps intelligence in other organs. Okay, the digestive system is probably the most cited in this area. How the digestive system plays a fundamental role in mood disorders, in mental health in general, but also in terms of emotional intelligence, emotional cognition, we could say, and even the heart as an organ. But aside from that, the scientific consensus is that, as far as we know, the brain still plays a major role. And yet, you should not view the brain as a creator of content. Okay, the research is pretty clear. Yes, there is still some disagreement on how to interpret the data, but in my estimation, this disagreement is becoming more and more uh, theoretical attempt to distrust the current scientific evidence based on suspiciousness rather than solid scientific evidence. So, yes, the brain plays a role, but it's a role of a radio. So, if our consciousness is real, and based on everything we say in this semester, yes, we could say that our consciousness is definitely real. We can also infer that consciousness is something that exists independently from our body, independently from the brain. As in, you listen to a radio, you listen to a wonderful song, the song exists independently from the radio as the radio station, the radio as the radio waves, the radio as the radio machine, structure, physical element you have on your car that allows you to listen to that music. Yes, you could say, if I don't have a radio, I cannot listen to it. The same way as I don't have a MP3 player, I cannot listen to it. If I don't have a smartphone, I cannot listen to that. But that does not mean that the music did not exist or does not exist even simultaneously. So, considering consciousness as something that exists independently from matter, but can be perceived through matter, it's a very solidly scientific based approach. Let's continue. And by the way, the image here is an image of Meucci, the inventor of the telephone, and I just like to mention that because it's this connection to what we cannot perceive immediately with our senses, but can be filtered through other technological devices. The next slide is Marconi, the inventor of the radio, I also want to include the Croatian, Serbian, Yugoslav Nikola Tesla in this slideshow. Perhaps in the following one I'll do that. So research indicates that the need for metaphysical experience is universal. Is there more than subjective interpretation? So this is the next question. All right, we can see how consciousness can be perceived as a non-body feature, something that goes beyond matter, something that's transcendental, goes beyond, okay? But that doesn't really make it more scientific in terms of how we interpret that. So is there more than just what we can all agree to disagree? Is it something that it's completely up to the person? Like, I believe in it, you don't believe in it, let's just meet in between, or let's avoid the discussion. The answer is no. We can study consciousness in a very objective manner. We can study consciousness in a very scientific way. And I did mention a few researchers in the past. I mentioned, for instance, the model by Hameroff and Penrose, Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose. Stuart Hameroff from a perspective of anesthesia, so a biomedical model, and Roger Penrose from a mathematical standpoint. And I also mentioned the research by Gerald Edelman, the research by Giulio Tononi. So you have many models of consciousness that are as scientific from the perspective of empirical observation, laboratory studies, as well as strong mathematical logical foundations. So I don't want to cite every single study. For the ones of you that are enrolled in this course, I'll provide a link to all the studies in the module. But in the next slide, I decide to add a few names whose research is going to be cited today. Beauregard, Bello, Deswal, Echavarria, Poli, Hillman, Moody, Assagioli, Parnia, Grayson, Rowan, Allos, Fingelkotz, Blanke, Stevenson, Feynman, Lehman, and Underhill. And there are many, many others. I should perhaps also include the research by Rupert Sheldrake in terms of non-located state of consciousness. And one thing I want to share with all of you is that a lot of these researchers, not a lot of them, but few of these researchers, I should rephrase this, are sometimes considered to be paranormal researchers or parascientific researchers. I really encourage you not to discard their studies based on the weight of the term parascientific, okay? Because very often parascientific, especially in sources that are not really scientific themselves, are considered to be pseudoscientific. Well, this is absolutely not true, and it's not true because it's not a question of opinion. You can argue whether their studies are constructed well, if they have validity, consistency, maybe ethical integrity, if their mathematical calculations are correct or not. And if they are, whether you agree with the results or not, it's completely irrelevant. You cannot label a research as pseudoscientific simply because you don't like what they observe, or because they dare to study something that's usually not part of the scientific consensus. For two main reasons. One, because the consensus itself is predicated upon current knowledge. And so some skepticism is warranted. You cannot just embark on something, because you are frustrated on the current research that's to be done. It's a question of agreeing or disagreeing with the results based on logical patterns. And the second thing is because very often this type of research is not funded in the same way as more biological research. But the interesting thing is that a lot of this criticism come from sources that are really not scientific themselves, which is kind of an oxymoron, and also is hypocritical. So if you consider Wikipedia a scientific source, well, I'm sorry to disappoint you. In any case, let's continue. So I will not cite every study that I will discuss today. Just please know that those are the main researchers that I will be citing today. And I would say especially the research by Poli, a wonderful, wonderful researcher, psychotherapist, and psychiatrist, was instrumental in discussing this topic. That's something that I want to mention also to provide the proper reference to her research. All right. So the brain perceives the spirit. Okay, that's what I wanted to discuss here. First of all, let's start with an image here. You see our friends, the lobes, right? In blue, the frontal; in dark red or maroon, the parietal lobe; in light green, the occipital lobe; in teal or blue, blue-green, the temporal lobe; and then you see in orange the brainstem and the cerebellum in purple or fuchsia. I want you to pay attention to the orientation association area, okay, so top left, and the attention association area, top right. Multiple brain areas are activated and work differently during prayer, meditation, and transcendental experiences. So again, if the question is, are we trying to find reasons for the belief in a consciousness separated from the brain? What better way to do that but studying the brain during practices that, traditionally speaking, for centuries and millennia past, are associated with consciousness, with achieving a different state of presence. And so here I mentioned prayer, meditation, and transcendental experiences all at once. I do understand that this can be confusing because the prayer, it's not the same as meditation, and transcendental experiences is too vague of a term. But for the sake of clarity, I put them together because all the studies that I cited focus on all three areas. So when we pray, when we meditate, okay, and we have these transcendental experiences that can be induced through prayer, but can also be, let me use the term, gifted to us without us looking for them, as in this eureka moment, as in this positive possession of ourselves, something that we just perceive, transcendentally speaking. The brain is activated in a way that really separates it from everything else. We are more focused, more attentive, more in tune without being over attentive, over ruminating, losing the bigger picture by getting stuck in the detail, okay? Which is not really usually what happens because if you fall asleep, you let go of things, and your brain is not as quote unquote precise in the perception of the world as you are during, let's say, studying and preparing for a test, right? If you're tired, you're not as focused, right? Or if you're under the influence of alcohol, let's say, you're not as focused. You might be less uh, inhibited, but you're not focused. While if you pray and meditate, the AAA, the triple A, the attention association area, and the OAA, the orientation association area, are activated. They are more in tune. And this augments and enhances the person present. It does not lower it, limit it, or make it less precise, which is fascinating. So, this assumption that you have hard science that you can only achieve through cognitive over studying the material, and this is opposed to meditation and prayer that makes you feel good, but it's really not scientific, it's not precise, you're just really doing things to relax. It's really not true from the scientific standpoint. You have a very different way to perceive the world. Yes, you could make the case that the left hemisphere does not work the same way as it works in daytime activity. And the same applies to the right hemisphere that's magnified in this more inclusive, not necessarily homogeneous, but holistic perspective. And yet, as an implied, the attention association area, the orientation association area work in a much more enhanced way, which is fascinating. Okay, so you don't lose consciousness. Your consciousness reaches higher level when you pray and meditate, and the research is extremely clear. All right, next slide. More than just physical perception. So this image here shows differences in the way we relate to others. And I mentioned this research before. I suggest that you watch the other lecture on sleep and consciousness from my psychology, so intro to psychology course that discusses all the research about attention, selective attention, attentional blindness, etc., change blindness. And you have some of these representation here, how we perceive the world, where we are in the, so to speak, cocktail party effect, whether we can pay attention to the person in front of us talking to us, as opposed to when we hear our name, someone is calling our name or someone mentions us. and also the difference in brain activation in the pictures below. You see this brain diagram, this sectional diagram, where you have anesthesia, seizure, and normal consciousness. You see the different parts that are activated. The same parts that we just mentioned, by the way. Okay. So it is more than just physical perception. This is important, especially in relation to brain activity in or during other tasks. Brain imaging studies indicate different types of modulations. So not only you have different areas of the brain that are activated, but you also have different modulations. So you have differences in terms of the physical areas that are present, the way they are present. So you have a consciousness modulated on multiple consciousness, as if each part of the brain has its own intelligence, its own consciousness, and that as if it's not metaphoric, you can study it, you can actually observe it with your eyes, not naked eyes. You need functional brain imaging research, you need EEG, etc., but you can still observe it. It's not a question of belief. You can see it. And on top of that, you have the connection between brain waves and biochemical function. So again, this connection between the action potential and neurotransmission. The next slide, the difference between the activation of the brain areas. Look at the insula here, look at the ACC, the caudate nucleus, etc., between mystical experiences and baseline experiences. Clarification here. The term mystical has to do with the Greek root mus, M-Y-S, that can be translated as whispered secret, something along that line. It's similar to the Germanic rune, which is the root of the term runes. The runes, the runic alphabet, if you're familiar with the runes that we mentioned in week 4, I believe, those ancient Germanic alphabets, or the Ogham alphabets in the Celtic alphabet, or the Göktürk alphabet, if you want to mention the Turkic people, etc. So a secret that is whispered because you cannot fully understand it. So this whisper, it's symbolic of something that happens on a subconscious level, okay? So you're not fully hear the message, it's whispered to you. And it's something you can achieve not by daytime activity. It's a mystical experience because it's beyond the veil of Maya, if you want to cite Far Eastern philosophy and mythology, right? Maya. This is a temporary working solution to the mind-body problem, all right? So on week 7, I think it's time for us to make a stand, or rather make a stand, it sounds more like a political statement, have a clear understanding of what the science does or does not say. The science at this point, it's clear, does not claim that consciousness is only body related, okay? Yes, as human beings, we do need our body to perceive it, okay? But first of all, there are multiple types of awareness. Some of it is subconscious and some of it is fully conscious, but consciousness itself is independent from our body, okay? Furthermore, to be more specific, our most primitive, ancient, instinctual, body-incarnated brain areas are activated subconsciously, which is to say subcortically. What does that mean? It means that you have cortical functions, okay? So prefrontal cortex, all the cortex, the outermost layer of your brain, which bring things to our fully aware consciousness, okay? If you remember, I mentioned that the limbic system is kind of this computer, and the cortex, the bark of the brain, is like a screen upon which the image is projected. So if you don't see the image, you don't know the image is there, and yet the image exists in your computer, does not go away. What's even more interesting is that this information is, first of all, the most ancient and primitive, both in historical terms, but also in very neuroscientific developmental terms. It's the first part of the brain that develops, and it's the part of the brain that contains this activation, this mystical activation. Okay, the spirit, the soul lives in this subcortical, under the cortex, limbic areas, the connection between the limbic system and the cortex. Okay, So yes, we are our bodies. We shouldn't reject our bodies. We're not just spirits, so to speak. We're not just souls. Excuse me. We are our bodies. Okay. And if you're interested in this from a theological perspective, I I will be happy to answer some of these questions. I like to focus on the science in this course, but if you have a theological question about that, one thing that I can mention is the role that the body plays in the theology of the body, for instance, and how different perspectives look at different angles to explain consciousness. So you have perspective that would use the term metempsychosis, like the soul traveling, like traveling of the soul, transcending of the soul, which is connected to reincarnation, re-embodiment, and other perspective that use terms such as resurrection, the resurrection of the body, so that the mind and body are two things that work in cooperation. So yes, we are our bodies. We see consciousness through our bodies, more specifically through our brain. But this does not negate the spirit. Quite the contrary, it shows how the spirit activates the body. Okay, and not just in philosophical or symbolic terms, but as I mentioned earlier, when I talked about the circadian rhythm, and now when we talk about all these brain areas, you can actually follow it. You can follow your consciousness in those studies. Okay, so yes, fMRI studies are correlates. They don't tell us everything about it, but if you can actually see it, it's really hard to negate the existence of such factors. All right, let's continue. Relatedness and religion. All right, so everything we said so far means that we do not have to be afraid of technology or afraid for animals. All right, what do I mean by that? Some of you in your comments and emails expressed some concern that's actually relatively widespread, as in, I'm oversimplifying things here. I don't claim that every single student mentioned this topic or this concern the exact same way as I'm going to express it now. I'm just going to make a summary of it. So, I am afraid that one day computers will take over the world, or that artificial intelligence will destroy human intelligence, or that we already lost the war against social media or smartphones, and they already won. We can never perform or outperform computers as human beings. Okay, so this is what I mean by afraid of technology. There's no turning back. That we as human beings are becoming more and more useless. Okay, and by the way, this is not far fetched as an assumption. There are a lot of I don't know intellectual, not capital I dare to say, that would embrace that. And I find myself in complete disagreement with that, and I'll explain in a second why. If I want to mention a few of these researchers, well, some of which I'm quite fond of. Perhaps some parts of Steven Pinker, some parts of Jordan Peterson, some parts of, actually a significant part of everything Yuval Harari writes, for instance. I found myself in complete disagreement with it. So this means being afraid of technological development. And the other one is being afraid for animals, as in we are afraid that we become so arrogant as human beings that we no longer see how we are animals ourselves, and we become so entitled to destroy nature, to abuse nature and animals and plants, because we feel we're completely different, and therefore we should just use them at our unethical will. Okay, no, both of these extremes are wrong. We are different. Our primitive brain areas are more similar to animals. Okay, in terms of our instinctual self, the self that knows it without thinking about it, without rationalizing it, on an instinctual level. Okay, on an intuitive level. Keep in mind that intuitive means to go within, to go inside, into it, right? This part, it's more similar to animals for the simple reason that from the structural, functional, and neurodevelopmental perspective, this is true. Okay, but our cortical functions are more similar to computers. They are more refined than animals. And now you don't really need to be an ethologist to understand this, studying ethology, studying animals, or a biologist to understand this. Um, this does not negate our current understanding based on evolutionary biology. Okay, evolution is still a theory, but at this point is the most scientifically accurate one, the one that, despite of very significant mathematical issues in categorization in evolution, uh, we cannot say that it's not one of the best, if not the best explanation for the way we got here as physical bodies. So yes, we could certainly say that our ancestors are other animals, and you can also observe, for instance, behavioral studies to see that it is definitely the case. And the fact that in terms of body functions, we are extremely similar to animals, especially to mammals, and even more to primates. Okay, so this is true. Okay, but at the same time, one of the quotes that I always like to mention by David Berlinski is, well, if we are exactly the same as animals, think about the brain or emotions or cognitive function, why is that the gorilla is behind bars and we are not? Okay, and this is more than just ethnocultural differences. Yes, we have put each other behind bars multiple times. We have a prison system. We have wars. We have concentration camps. We had horrible things done to fellow human beings. Okay, as a result of politics, as a result of hatred, as a result of war. Okay, but the opposite never happens in the animal kingdom. Okay, so this is a quote that does not negate the ethics, the moral structure, the importance of viewing ourselves as part of nature. But the truth is that there is no animal Nobel Prize winner. You don't have any, I don't know, mathematical theory, surgical procedure, poem, painting performed by any animal. Okay, and even the studies that appear to indicate that you can teach a big ape how to have a conversation, in the end really demonstrated there was just repetition of random sounds, only in very few occasions full words, and it was just repetition with never mastery or even basic understanding. So these areas that we have much more similar to computers are much deeper and higher than both. So yes, if you take any of these skills separately, we might lose the battle. Okay, if we want to look at that from perspective, our consciousness is less than the one on computer or the animal. For instance, a lion might show more of a resilient self in the savannah, okay, in the forest. Okay, we will not be able to survive the same way. A gorilla is much more active and strong that we can possibly be. Okay, we will never be able to swim like a fish. Okay, we will never be able to fly like an eagle, right? Or we will never be able to calculate as many things as a computer does. Okay, or share things with the same level of speed and precision the computer does, or the internet. Okay, and yet all these things are separated. Okay, when we think about stuff like this, really makes me kind of chuckle when I hear statements that, well, this your smartphone substituted all the things all packed into one device: calculator, camera, internet, phone. Just because you pack it together, it doesn't mean that the product itself is synonymous with its ontological essence. We created smartphones. Keep that in mind, okay? Not the other way around, okay? So we can continue this conversation, but this is very nurturing. So we should not be afraid of technology. Technology has definitely a place, and without technology, we could not know the things we are saying now. Yes, the research clearly indicates that all this traditional knowledge about consciousness, spirituality, and meditation was absolutely right to a T all along, but we needed technology to demonstrate that empirically. So thankfully, we have this technology. We should not go back in an obscurantist, backward mentality. We need technology. At the same time, we are nature. We are part of nature. We are animals. Those are our family too, okay? And this is consistent with neuroscience, philosophy, and theology. The example I mentioned here is the rational soul. I'm borrowing this from Aquinas. Okay, so there are different types of souls, and yes, to this extent, animals also have souls. Okay, otherwise they will not be called animals, right? Plants too, but we have rational souls. All right, some examples here, because we mentioned this intelligence, this emotional intelligence, this body intelligence. So this is one of the research that I just want to briefly quote. Um, None of the research before this is a research that my team and I did a few years ago at University of Vermont Medical Center, and it was a research that studied the effect of physical exercise on mental health. Okay, and long story short, we created two exercise areas in the inpatient psychiatry unit at the hospital, one on Shepherdson 3 and one on Shepherdson 6. And these two psychiatric units are locked units. And on Shepherdson 3, you have more mood and personality disorders. And after on Shepherdson 6, you have more schizophrenia, psychosis, and related disorders overall. Okay. And so we want to see if exercise was helping with the patient's self-esteem, mood, presence, overall well-being, and ultimately prognostic feature as well. Now, this is one research that intuitively you know to be true. If you ever exercise, and by exercise I really mean anything, if you just go for a walk, you do some stretching, the likelihood you feel better afterwards, even if you feel more physically tired, is intuitively true. You don't need a neuroscientific research to demonstrate that. But we do research to see how the consistency of this data can be viewed as a fact, right? The patient perceived positive changes in both psychological and physical terms were indicated by responses provided by the patients to the question, did the exercise group improve your mood? To which 93.2% of patients on the first population examined responded affirmatively. For are you pleased with the way your body feels now? The positive responses amount to 93%, which is really, really high, not just in statistical terms, but in any possible term. And in the next slide, very similar outcomes for the second study group with 90.6% for are you pleased with the way your body feels now, and 96.8% for did this exercise group improve your mood. As the study indicated, these results were not only instrumental in the examination of the current psychophysical state of affairs, but to monitor the future-oriented motivation strategies thereby implemented, with the majority of subjects expressing interest in continuing a fitness routine. This is exemplified in the affirmative answer to, after attending this group, do you think you will exercise more? With 97.6% for the first study group, and the totality of patients on the second subject population examined, 100%. What does this mean? It means a variety of things. First of all, that exercise makes you feel better. Okay, and this is just a summary of, not even a summary, just an extract of the research we conducted. But the first thing that we want to ask was, we just want to monitor something more than body function. So in any type of quantitative research, when you study feelings, emotions, body, awareness, you could say, well-being, etc., you need to also study the basics. Okay, and by that I mean in medicine we study patient vitals, so you can monitor their heart rate, oxygenation rate. You can monitor things such as cortisol level, right? And cortisol is associated with stress, so you can see whether it's increasing or decreasing. So you monitor something physical, okay? And then on top of that, you can also monitor things using fMRIs and brain studies. So the data is consistent, okay? And we have patient vitals taken all the time at the hospital, definitely at every change of shift. but also more often than that due to the pharmacological intervention the patients undergo in psychiatry. So we have that data. The data was already consistent. But we also wanted to ask the patient directly. We also wanted to have a qualitative study. We want to ask surveys and questionnaires. Why is that? Because we're studying consciousness. Your body might already be aware of something that you are not aware of. Okay, so even if your body is telling you, I'm starting to feel better or I'm starting to feel worse, you might not be fully aware of that. Okay, so we have to ask the direct question. How do you feel? Are you pleased with the situation? Are you pleased with your body? Are you pleased with the way the body feels? And this creates a cascade of positive change whereby the body starts to feel better neurochemically speaking. You have a more balanced levels of beta endorphins, of dopamine, of serotonin, etc. And then the body feels itself feeling better, okay, because it develops a more of awareness. In fact, the more you exercise, the more you crave exercising, to the point that the brain might actually start to confuse stimuli, inner stimuli, right? So you might think that you were hungry for food, and you realize the more you exercise, you're actually physically hungry for exercising or for stretching or for meditating. It's a fascinating thing where the body wakes up. So the body feels better. The body feels that it feels better, and you start to feel that the body is starting to feel that it feels better. Okay? So 3 levels of feelings, 3 levels of awareness, 3 levels of progressively enhanced consciousness. On top of that, as you can imagine, in psychological problems, mood disorder, etc., where the person might be not prone to, for instance, show up for a psychotherapy session, they might be more prone to do that if they are thinking of, I'm just exercising. And then once they feel better, they might be more prone to say, okay, today I'm going to exercise as well as I will attend a group therapy session. And they might be more social. And this is a cascade of positive effects. So this is how consciousness is very real. Okay, you can study it from the perspective of brain waves, EEG, more specifically, action potentials. You can study from the perspective of brain functional structures, fMRI. You can study from the perspective of chemistry, and again, beta endorphins, noradrenaline, dopamine, serotonin. You can study from the perspective of mind-body connection. I feel physically better. My thoughts are crisper, more precise, more elegant, more nurturing, more positive, more happy. You can study that from the perspective of philosophy. The demonstration of the connection between mind and body is consistent with the logical understanding of this perspective. And you can also study from the spiritual or religious perspective. So, quite nurturing ways to see that. Now, I mentioned body wisdom and the way we study the body. In the next slide here, I wanted to cite phrenology again. This is an image from a German textbook about phrenology. And if you remember, phrenology was this pseudo-scientific attempt to force, so to speak, something that is philosophical, theoretical, into something physical. So we know of the existence of worries. We know of the existence of anxiety. We know of the existence of happiness. We know of the existence of eroticism or love or hatred or jealousy or whatever you want. Okay? We want to force this concept into something physical because, after all, if we are scientists, we study matter, not philosophical discussion. We want to see it. And the mistake that phrenology did was to force something that is not physical to a physicality that was completely detached. Okay. In this image, you see all these areas in German. Okay, on the bottom, next to the neck, or the circular mastoideus muscles, you see the citation here: "Erkenne dich selbst," which is Gnosis Selthon, or know thyself, know yourself. Okay, and all these different areas like jealousy and hatred and love, etc., etc. The mistake here was not to think that for all our emotions, our thoughts, we have a corresponding neural mechanism. That is true. We were able to demonstrate that. The mistake was that Just because something is physical, it needs to create and contain all of that, which is definitely not true. Okay, so this is the problem: evidence versus eminence, a selective problem. Evidence is what we need to observe, something we can see, something we can demonstrate scientifically. Eminence is what we think we know, but we really don't. It's trusting something just because it sounds or looks scientific. Okay, so what looks scientific might be scientific or might not be scientific. We have to be extremely careful. At the beginning of any serious inquiry into the ontological nature, ontology is the essential, what the property of being, the essential nature of a human being, one must face the selective problem of deciding which areas of investigation and related methods to incorporate such analysis and which areas one ought to reject. So far in this course, we venture into multiple ways to understand consciousness. And the good news is that all these areas, all these ways to study consciousness are actually leading to the same conclusion. And that's precisely what we should use as a healthy, skeptical way to study it. You study every area independently, okay? You don't mix science and religion. You don't mix fMRIs with Aristotle. You do not mix studying cortisol levels with, I don't know, optic nerves or something like that. You study everything separately, and then you see whether you have more or less scientific evidence as to why one part might be a good explanation for the other, or at the very least, a good continuation, combination, even correlation, okay, or complementary, okay, to the other areas. That's exactly the way we should study it. The next one, truth and connection. Remember, learning how to feel better also means learning how to be better at feeling. Another thing that I really want you to bring home from this semester, okay? I mentioned multiple times that we cannot only rely on our feelings. Facts are important because our feelings can fluctuate, but we can learn how to be better at feeling, okay? We can be more closer to truth. Our feelings, our emotions, our thoughts can be closer to a true representation of reality. In these two diagrams that I drew a few years ago for the book, you see dopamine and serotonin pathways on one side and areas associated with emotional perception and representation of the area. Okay, so we can be more refined in feelings. So look at this example. What would be in terms of emotional reaction a problem? Well, a problem would be falling for extremes when you feel more intensely when you should be more objective and detached, or the opposite, you feel less, more cold-heartedly when you should be more empathetic and more involved. Okay, in the first case, these feelings might be over ruminated about by cortical areas, by the left hemisphere, by the prefrontal cortex. When you think you're getting more precise and attentive, but you're just ruminating, you're just stuck in the detail, and you become paranoid, you become over analytic, you become obsessive. Or on the opposite side, because you're being traumatized or hurt, you repress any type of emotion and you mask that with this scientific, cold, analytical self because you don't dare to open up the basket of your emotion because you will fall apart. So learning how to feel better is not, really is not about, well, as long as it makes you feel good, it must be good for you. This is absolute nonsense and extremely dangerous. Is the opposite, is learning how to be better at feeling, to understand our emotions first and foremost, okay? Next slide, above, below, beyond. So this is a funny image that I also took from the research by Polly that was published about, at this point, 15 years ago or so. And it's a nice image of the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo in Rome, in the Vatican State, and the superimposed limbic system here, okay, which is so fascinating because it's this is where our imagination can help. Okay, this is not to demonstrate that that God resides in our limbic system, but neuroscientifically speaking, it makes a lot of sense. Our instinctual, primitive, and by primitive I mean both first, prime, primus in Latin means the first. In fact, the term first is a cognate from the Indo-European linguistic perspective to primus, first, okay, and as well as to first, the prince in German. Okay, so the prince is the principal, the first among peers, right? So that is the limbic system that is connected to us or human self through the cortical function. Okay, it's a really good representation of how we can achieve the connection with the divine within ourselves by recognizing it, or in other words, be more aware, paying more attention. Okay, so above and below, just as the citation by Hermes Trismegistus said it when we talk about alchemy, as well as beyond the realms of this physical world. So everything happens for a reason is more than a bumper sticker. Our job as scientists is to better understand how, okay? Yes, everything does indeed happen for a reason, okay? But we need to explain the processes, the mechanisms. This is the job of a scientist, okay? Separation of magisterium, not taking everything for granted, understanding the how of things, okay? Very often we say that science explains the how of things, and philosophy, spirituality, theology explains the that, so to speak, okay? But of course, never quite to 100%, okay? So it's beyond our human understanding, but that's where we're aiming. So our job as scientists is to better understand how everything happens for a reason, okay? How these reasons are connected. And reason in science really means correlation and causation. That's what it means, right? This is our job as scientists. Our job as clinicians, if one day you will become a therapist, a psychologist, a counselor, etc., or a teacher, a parent, okay? Our job as clinicians is to utilize this information to help our patients heal, okay? We study psychology of consciousness to develop a higher level of consciousness, okay? So that we feel that we are made of love, really, as we will see in the next few slides. So some skepticism in the next slide. There's so much to cover here, so I just want to mention a few things about NDEs, near-death experiences, because it's one of the best ways to discuss consciousness. So I just mentioned that based on all the studies that we encounter, consciousness is not just in our body, so we need to study stuff. Stuff is wrong, a scientific term. We need to study phenomena that are outside of our bodies or that leaving our bodies, assuming. So near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences lead themselves to this type of interrogation in a very specific way for obvious reason. And of course, skepticism, okay? So criticism. There is no need for paranormal explanation, okay? The very fact that you mention something that's paranormal contradicts your scientific method, right? It is normal in a sense that it's the norm of science to study matter. So if it's paranormal, it's not scientific, right? It's similar to the God of the gaps. It's just a question of explaining things away. You don't need anything spiritualistic, okay? Everything has a materialistic explanation, okay? Everything. And yet, very often you hear certain science, well, not really many scientists, but some science, popular science defenders, so to speak, okay, on media saying, well, everything can be explained with matter. Everything can be explained by science, by materialistic science. Or maybe none at all. Everything is also random. So you see the intrinsic inconsistency, the tautological asymmetry of this problem, okay, the nonsense. On one side, you're saying everything can be explained materialistically speaking, but at the same time, nothing has a reason, nothing has a structure, nothing has a purpose. Everything is just randomness, okay? This is inconsistent. So, aside from the fact that this is illogical and really not scientific, I just want to mention some of this, which is usually called the materialistic or reductionist view here, la visione riduzionista. So I mentioned a few studies from Germany earlier. And now some of these images are from Italian researchers, especially Poli. So some neurobiological hypotheses alter blood gas level, hypoxia, anoxia, hypercapnia, periphery to foveal retinal ischemia, neurological factors, epilepsy, excitotoxic damage, glutamine, neurotransmitter imbalance, REM sleep intrusion, temporal lobe disorders, multisensory breakdown, right angular gyrus dysfunction, pharmacological factors, specifically opioids, steroids, ketamine, hallucinogens. And this is all matter based. And then you have a psychological hypothesis that makes a person think they're experiencing a near death experience due to expectation, depersonalization, derealization, dissociation, personality issues, birth model, and false memories. Now, none of that actually does any job in explaining things away. I will leave the specific reason why none of this can be a scientific account for NDE in the resources I'll provide on the module. I don't want to overwhelm you with citations in this slideshow. But even from a very broad perspective, you can see that this is all doing what phrenology was doing, forcing something physiological to something that is not physiological, okay? Yes, those things can also create an NDE. This is not what I'm trying to say. It is true that if we have any of this, we could think we have NDEs, okay? But again, this has to do with what we said earlier. We need to be better at feeling. We might think that we are in love, and we are not. That doesn't mean that love does not exist. We might think that we have seen someone and we didn't, but it doesn't mean that this someone does not exist. Okay? We might think that we I don't know, we put our wallet in our bag, in our purse, and then we open the purse, the bag, and the wallet is not there. But it does not mean that the wallet does not exist. Okay, so this is really not a good explanation of this non-body phenomenon. One more, science, not activism. Experience also means intent. The way we interpret an experience, and even more importantly, the way the experience acts on us, is determined by the intent through which we experience it. Some of these studies here by Gerald Verley is connected to these near-death experiences, an answer question published in 2009, and the difference between individuals that were jumping with a parachute as opposed to individuals that were jumping from the bridge to attempt suicide, and how different their experience was in terms of achieving something that they did not set up to achieve, this mystical experience, this seeing life as a movie that was reviewing the past, the present, and possibly even the future, okay? These non-locative properties, and how the people that were contemplating suicide and survived, okay, because they were jumping from the bridge and ended up, entering the water with their feet, so they were experienced horrible physical injuries, but they nevertheless survived, okay? They experienced peace, an inner peace, as described in a very consistent way as we can let go, we don't have anything to worry about. And the experiences did not correlate to what the people with the parachute were experiencing. So intent is really important. And that's what I mentioned, science, not activism. In modern times, I would say, especially in the US, for the last 5 to 10 years, we are so ready to point fingers, okay? When we say it doesn't matter what your intent was in saying those things and doing these things, what matters is what you've done. And it's really a very poor way to go about reality in the world. It's inconsistent from a scientific standpoint, is very imprecise from a psychological standpoint, and from a moral standpoint, it really creates more damage than healing. We should not point finger. We should work on ourselves before we judge others, okay? We don't know what's going on in another person's life. So before we label people as the good ones and the bad ones, as the one that quote unquote the right side of history or the quote unquote wrong side of history, Or even worse, if you don't agree with me, you're anti-me, you're anti-my perspective, we should really look at intent, okay? We might disagree on the methods. We might disagree on the way to achieve love, for instance, and tolerance, but we should not point fingers. This is really experiencing higher consciousness. This is what the brain shows in all those studies. When we see the bigger picture, we don't suck in the detail. Extremely important. All right, so a few more slides here. Foresight and providence, okay? Really almost a translation, providence and foresight, both from an etymological perspective as well as from a theological perspective. Providence, the ability, the divine intervention, right? Someone will use the term, again, ruach, or spirit, Holy Spirit, to see beyond what we can perceive with our eyes, okay? On a neurological level, the activation and perception of free will and related emotional, cognitive, behavioral responses follow a bottom-up, top-down regulation, which is exactly what we said earlier about the relation between the limbic system and the cortex, okay? Control means knowledge, means understanding, does not mean repression, okay? The cortical signaling happens via the anterior cingulate cortex, ACC, that is connected with response conflict, okay, you see here in blue, right? And the posterior cingulate cortex, PCC, perceptual conflict, okay? You see that in blue as well, okay? Perceptual conflict, think of the role in the connection between the occipital lobe and the parietal lobe, the vision and perception. Also, the subcortical signaling via the cerebellum, temporal violation, and the basal ganglia, frequency violation. And finally, the prefrontal cortex implements control through selection and judgment, i.e., biasing relevant signals. Okay, so we understand the bigger picture, but we need to understand what to filter out and what to let in. Okay, and that's how the brain signals a higher level of perception, of awareness, ultimately of consciousness. Okay, which also mean same picture as before, but different description. Remember, learning how to think better also means learning how to be better at thinking, right? So earlier was learning how to feel better, also means learning how to be better at feeling. This applies to thinking as well, okay? So our higher self, our higher consciousness also means our rational soul. It's complementing things. All right, some brief philosophical discussion here. Freedom and control. All the studies I mentioned before are neuroscientific studies. Now, something that is at the intersection between neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy. In the interpretation by Kornhuber and Decker, 2012, there are ways human beings can increase the level of freedom through an improvement of the self. Okay, increase the level of freedom. The topic here is are we free or not? Does free will exist? And I will encourage you to review what we said in week 3, 4, and 5, especially in the context of free will, free want, veto power in the brain, and experiments such as the Libet experience, Libet. Okay, so please review that if you're not sure what free will has to do with consciousness. Okay, so they claim that human beings can increase their freedom, their levels of freedom, through an improvement of the self, as opposed to what? What can be detrimental to our freedom? Self-mismanagement and certain forms of self-improvement, which would lead to an incremental loss of degrees of such freedom. So self-improvement, I want to mention here, is that certain practices in certain pseudo-psychological circles, unfortunately, I see that a lot in coaching and health coaching. The assumption is that I will listen to you, I will value everything you have to say with no judgment. And it's extremely slippery slope. Because if you come to me as a counselor, as a therapist, I should tell you the things that you need to change in your life. Okay? So certain form of self-improvement become extremely narcissistic, self for the sake of self itself, and any type of control is to be perceived as an attack on my freedom. This is really not good from a ontological perspective. It's not true, and also it's not healthy. Now, this interpretation by Kornhuber and Decker is fully consistent with those religious perspectives according to which the concept of sin and repentance involve an external source of judgment and activation. Draverman, 1999. I really encourage you to study some of his research, really the connection between Buddhist practices, meditation, theology, and solid neuroscience. So, why is the reason? Well, because we as human beings, parts of this world and in this world, cannot have full free will, as this will entail complete freedom from nature, which we are part of. Okay, so if we want to liberate our consciousness, if we want our brain to experience this enhanced sense of self, we need to also to nurture the things that we think are constricting us, squeezing us. We cannot be free from nature. So if you want to use a theological explanation here, we don't need many miracles, because either, as Einstein was quoted saying, either you see the world, you go through life thinking that everything is a miracle or none is a miracle. Okay, but miracle is something outside of nature in itself, is not needed to explain consciousness, because we use nature to express ourselves, the same way as the true nature of a bird is to fly, not to swim. Okay, the bird will not complain about the fact that the bird cannot swim, right? Or the opposite, the nature of a fish is to swim, not to fly. Okay, so this is not constricting or repressing our freedom, is expressing the best possible self by using nature. Let's continue. An explanation of these areas all at once. Inner balance, top to bottom. So this is a simplified version of everything we said about the limbic system being this more primitive, ancient, traditional, and divine self, and the core is a more rational, higher self. Okay. Traditional, spiritual, religious understanding of free will are fully supported by neuroscientific evidence, e.g. the series of studies, for instance, by Sartori and De Fanti, 2012, and the substantiating claim that our belief in the existence of free will has the power to impact the readiness potential. So brace yourself here. This research shows that if you do believe that you have free will, you have more free will. If you don't believe that you have free will, you have less free will. Now, notice how connected this is to the divine. Okay, there is a long series of metaphysical discussion, especially in the Sufi tradition in Islam, and even in Zoroastrianism, in the Druze tradition. You can read something about that in Khalil Gibran, for instance, or in Rumi. Like, there is no guarantee that you ever find God through prayer, and I don't know, mysticism, mystical practices, fasting. There's no guarantee that you will meet God with prayer. In other words, there's no guarantee that you ever realize whether God exists by keep looking for God. But there is one guarantee, that if you never do anything about it, you won't. Okay? Certainly, there are exceptions to the rule. We mentioned earlier the role of providence. You might be gifted with a spiritual encounter with your divine self. Faith as an encounter with God directly, as God calling upon you. Okay? And then use God, as I mentioned multiple times this semester, in a broader sense. Okay? Some people are more comfortable with terms such as higher power, for instance. Fair. But the fact that the scientific side indicates that the more you open up your heart to this perspective, the more likely this perspective will join you. Okay? Now, this study is 2012, so I mentioned this before. Please consider these studies as valid, not because I'm asking you to do, but because all the studies I'm citing here have been replicated and proven again and again and again. I usually like to cite the first studies that discover that, and then unless there is another study that clearly contradicts the results, then it's fair that the scientists should be cited as such. So the readiness potential has to do with the reaction time, right? With the Libet experiments about the limbic system, about the free will. So if you do believe in the existence of free will, you have a decrease in time positively, and if you don't, you have an increase in time. Fascinating research, okay? By virtue of our judgment of this positivity and negativity, with strong neural connection to cognitively driven versus emotionally driven activation response. So in this image here, you see that if this flow of consciousness, this stream of consciousness goes from the cortex through the limbic system and eventually leading to response, this is cognitively driven, higher rationalization, or better explained, rational self. You're in control. If instead it's emotionally driven, without being filtered, it could go through the cortex, which is healthy, it's analyzed, perceived, and then eventually goes back to response. But if it goes straight to response, it could lead to something positive in an instinctual level. Think about what we said about the olfactory bulb. But it could also be an overreaction because there's not enough filter, okay? So there's always a risk to believe in something for the sake of belief without any explanation, okay? There is an Italian scientist, his name is Marcello Truzzi, who came out with this fascinating, beautiful quote. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Okay, so if you want to claim that something happened because of God, because of miracle, you better have a very high level of evidence to make the claim. And this assumption was somewhat twisted and reutilized by certain philosophers. I think of Christopher Hitchens, also popularized similar statements. And Christopher Hitchens was wonderful in other areas of philosophy, but in my estimation, not specifically in this part. His brother, on the contrary, I think did a wonderful job. But in any case, you need to study science in order to verify whether these claims are correct or not. And to go back to science and going back to week 5, inner balance frequency, okay, we went from inner balance top to bottom, cortex, limbic system response. Now we're talking about frequencies. So rather than talking about chemistry, as we've seen, rather than talking about brain function and structures and neurological areas, now we go back to where we started from, brain waves, EEG. You already know all about this. I'm sure you studied that in depth, so you know everything about delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma waves and the differences between REM phases of sleep and non-REM phases of sleep. But if you're experiencing mystical factors, if you're praying, you're meditating, you have the best of both worlds. You're reaching gamma waves. It's an enhanced, physically demonstrable enhancement of conscious level. Fantastic. State of consciousness change. This change is verifiable not only through fMRI and similar brain imaging study, but also through direct electroencephalogramic examination. Prayer and meditation will reach the highest level of consciousness. Okay, so you don't need to necessarily trust the Buddhist monk or the Zoroastrian philosopher, the Jewish rabbi, the Islamic scholar, whatever religion you want to pick to see that. Science contributes to this understanding in a very significant way. All right, so let's continue. We have about 5 slides or so left. Traditional, archaic, archetypical. Cortical processes, see previous discussion on prefrontal cortex and related areas, develop later in human life. They help understand, interpret, share, modulate, inhibit, and veto other processes which are limbically located. Okay, so there is truth in the limbic system. We might be aware of it or not, but we might interpret it correctly or not correctly. We need a filter. It is not repression or suppression which heals. It is control. The most ancient parts, the most traditional, are the less cortical. They are eternal. They are universal. Understanding, revealing, discovering. This is where the scientific efforts meet the inner experience. Okay, so it's not a question of of choosing, but understand the proper role. Okay, this image is an image of the Exelsteiner in Germany, and it's a place where a lot of mystical activities and philosophical groups and folklore ensemble and things such as yoga retreats, neo-pagan, Wicca gathering, traditional religious rituals, practice, even folk metal festivals are practiced there as well. So I just like that because it also reminded me of a beautiful painting by Berkeley, the Island of the Dead, which was a representation of, they claim, the Lake Garda close to where I'm from. So we need science in a cognitive, cortically based understanding to explain things, because we might not be ready to understand things in a metaphysical sense. Okay, I mentioned this multiple times. When you study consciousness, the risk is that you might fall for cults, right? For pseudo gurus, and you completely disregard the science in an attempt to find a truth that doesn't require studying. Well, this is not a good idea. If this is the truth, science should also be able to understand it. Okay, not explain it away, not that science can study everything, but you need to combine those things. So in the next slide, sensibility and sensitivity. Okay, so I'm talking about something that's eternal. Okay, so one of the most ancient representations of Buddha here, as well as the Akkadian, Sumerian tradition, Mesopotamian tradition here as well. The fact that we have senses that we use on everyday basis to understand the world, and then we have parasensorial abilities that we can achieve via meditation, via prayer, etc. All of which can be seen by science. Okay, it's not that we disappear, okay, but it's still fascinating, similar to what happened in the study of anesthesia. Where is ourself when we are not fully in our body? Okay. Neuroscience also informs our current understanding, that is, it shows empirically of Thomistic perspective regarding perceptual modalities in human beings. Again, I'm going back to Aquinas here. Okay, Thomistic means Thomas Aquinas, including our five senses, the five senses we discussed from a neurobiological perspective, and the sense of the divine, the sensus divinitatis. Okay, divinitas in Latin sometimes is translated with spirituality, higher power, Godhead, divine being, etc. Okay, the sense of the divine. And more importantly, for the purpose of this area of analysis, the sensus communis, okay, which is more than common sense, okay. Common sense in modern Italic languages, think of Italian, common sense, it's not translated as senso comune, but it's translated as buon senso. It's kind of a lower level, but sensus communis also means the sense that is shared. We all come from the same source as human beings, and the term communis has to do with community, but also with shared worth. Com, from cum, cum in Latin for together, and munis, munitas, from worth, from money, from coins, from the word we put together, okay? So we reach the divine by virtue of understanding the connection among each other, the fact that we are all brothers and sisters, we all siblings, we're all the same family. Free will, thus, is consistent with the ultimate good in the sense that it's contained by it, or it's a manifestation of it, okay? So it's contained by this sense, so you have this direct understanding, and if you reach these gamma waves in the EEG while meditating, while praying, you have this direct connection, or is a manifestation of it in other areas of neurological understanding. Okay? Manifestation is where the divine shows itself using nature, right? Is this epiphany, right? Again, it is a power for the good, not freedom from freedom itself. It's really important. You're detached from that, okay? In Buddhist tradition, the detachment from emotions is not to say that emotions are necessarily bad, but emotions are not facts, okay? Facts, not feelings, okay? You need to be detached enough to be connected to your emotional self, but not let emotion determine, guide you without any cortical activation, okay? Power for the good, not for freedom itself, freedom for freedom itself. All right. facts and opinion. Okay, so I'm gonna give another explanation if I didn't give you enough explanations to why you should stick to the science. And let me start with the definition of opinion. What does it mean, opinion? Opinion from the Latin term opinare, which means touching with the eye, reaching with the eye, creating with the eye, based on the Sanskrit root opas, in the Greek office, also a perception, grasping, seeing, okay? So opsis, as in the Greek opsis, as the way to see through things, okay? So really providence, foresight, inner perception, but also means touching with the mind, not just with the eye. So two senses, right? With the mind, reaching with the mind, creating with the mind, okay? This one, it's also connected to the Sanskrit root op or up, okay? Keep in mind the distinction between consonant and vowels, okay, in the history of language. And this is found in opus or opera, okay? So you have an opinion, but your opinion creates reality. Science indicates that you believe in free will manifests itself more strongly. If you believe in the manifestation of something, this something shows itself, okay? Which is not to say that opinions are all that matter, okay? This is the postmodernist view. Your opinion is just as valid as anybody else's opinion. No. Ultimately, we need to verify whether science is in agreement or not with your personal opinion, okay? But we also mean that true opinion is based on perception, okay? And that's where we need to get better at perceiving things. We need to learn how to be better at feeling, at thinking. Now, if we do not incorporate neuroscientifically examined, philosophically analyzed, and experientially informed ontological hierarchy in our understanding of human free will, any therapeutic intervention will be pointless, given the absence of basic biological existence, and in the case of patient committing suicide. And B, there will be an a priori rejection of the skills, training, scope of practice, clinical, medical goals, and even basic human understanding a psychotherapist has, since this professional should be trained to see the good, beauty, and potential of the person she works with, despite or against the fact that the patient is not able to recognize them within herself or himself. So, understanding the fact that consciousness is something that leads us really to the good, the truth, and the beautiful also means the moral and scientific need to reject things that would prevent us from reaching that. So even if our patient, the person we work with, does not see how important it is to see that truth, the beauty, and the good. If they don't see themselves as worthy, for instance, okay? Life is worthy in itself, okay? Life is sacred in itself, okay? It doesn't really matter if by life you take on a reductionist perspective. Life is just biological life. I only care about neurotransmitters, hormones, biological factors, etc., etc. Fine. It is still relevant, it's still important. Or if you want to see life in a bios vis extended perspective, life as in higher power, mystical dimension, energy, is still worthy, it's still sacred. All right, last 2-3 slides. Little big death. A comparison here is between the big death and the little death. In the literature, both poetic as well as psychological or philosophical, the little death is the orgasmic response, the response during orgasm, and the big death is biological death, okay? So there's a comparison here, the citation which I will provide, between normal consciousness and what happens in cardiac arrest and brain death, and then orgasmic stimulation here, okay? So from the orgasmic response to biological death, the areas that are involved are the locus coeruleus, the right angular gyrus, the temporal lobe, the 5-HT2 receptor, and NMDA receptor, which also means that there is a separation of ourselves from ourselves. In physical death, we already seen that, not just in terms of the account of the patients that were able to provide very specific details about what they perceived once they were leaving their bodies. Okay, the research by Stevenson, for instance, the research by Moody, the research by Sheldrake, etc., etc. Even things that were not really easily explained that way. Skeptics might say, well, the person leaving their body during this quote unquote near-death experience under surgery, they were able um, to see something on the wall or hear the nurse talking with the doctor, because after all, part of the consciousness was still there, so they still were able to hear a little bit or see a little bit. They were just not able to retrieve it, so it was a subconscious, not metaphysical. And yet those things happen also when they were moving to a different room and they were reported things that in a room they were never there. And there's a lot of accounts, but also beside the account of the patient, what we observe in terms of the physical manifestation, how the brain changes itself, and even from a more biological, non-neurological perspective, how the brain is getting ready to, so to speak, leave this world. And the way for instance, a good example is how nociceptive factor play a role. Our pain perception is decreased when we are getting ready to leave this world, when we're ready to die. And there's a somewhat controversial bioethical debate as to what extent we should force life existence in a body that is ready to go. And that has to do with things such as do not resuscitate, do not intubate, pulling the plug, so to speak. But in any case, there is a connection between this idea of leaving the body physically during the physical death, as well as leaving the body to merge and morph into another body during the orgasmic response. Okay, again, different level of consciousness that are predicated upon different levels of neurotransmitters, hormones, EEG waves, and action potentials. Okay. Falling in love. I'd like to conclude this lecture with love. What better way to study neuroscience and psychology? Neuroscientific studies indicated there are multiple forms of love modulated by the activation hierarchical structure brain areas. Now, we're not talking about love languages here. There are plenty of psychological or pop psychology ways to define languages of love. Some people are more in tune with love and manifestation of physical proximity or physical touch. Some others might be more, let me use the term, interested in demonstration of love by doing things for each other, or cleaning one's apartment, or working on the car, working on the garden, buying gifts, social status, etc. We have all of that. Okay, there's plenty of research, also in terms of differences between gender in this regard. But it's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about psychological theories. We're talking about neuroscientific evidence. And I want to use the term in Italian because a lot of this research comes from Europe. Innamoramento subcorticale istintuale e innamoramento corticale superiore. Let me try to translate that somewhat not super specifically, and I'll tell you why. Fall in love in the subcortical instinctual limbic sense, or fall in love with the cortex and the superior area of the brain, superior in a physical sense, also in a metaphorical sense, okay? In this image you see on the left side, I'm no longer in love, or I was never in love, and on the right side, I am in love. The reason why it's hard to translate that is because language, yet again, plays a role in science and in truth. In English, we say we fall in love as if we are not in control at all, okay? You fall not because you make yourself fall in love, okay? Although that's debatable, but it's something that sees you as a passive agent, okay? You fall in love, okay? In Italian, instead, you ti innamori. It's active. It's a transitive verb. Well, it's a reflexive verb. You love yourself into something, okay? Kind of a poor translation here. And by the way, that's similar in other languages as well. In German, it's sich verlieben, right? So you make yourself love someone else. So it's more active. It's not passive. And so this also translates better because if the action of the love that you send onto another human being, if it's limbic or subcortical, is instinctual, but it's not necessarily targeted. It might be more true than the cortical one, but it's out of direction. If it's cortical, different areas are activated. Versus in the English, it might miss this kind of nuance, which is definitely true in the scientific perspective, okay? So this is not to say that in order to fall in love, you need to be over rational and over analytical. You might think that you can make yourself forced to fall in love with a person that you don't really like, and it's really not a good idea, okay? From a perspective of psychological health. Or the opposite, that everything about love is the moment or the period where you're falling in love. There is no such thing in italic language as falling out of love, because you never fell in the first place. It's not a full decision of yours. It's also mediated by, I use the term, spiritual encounters and people that you're supposed to meet in your life when you're supposed to meet them. Okay, everything comes for a reason, but it's not completely passive. And that's really a poor way to interpret love, because love, by definition, is just a consciousness. It's increasing, but you need to put work into it. It's not just something that occurs to you, and if you don't feel it, it's gone. It's really not, this is really not love. It's a very childish, immature way to see love, okay? Last slide to explain things away a little more. Again, today I'm Italian all the way, except for a few slides in German. Again, studying poly as well. There is a continuum, yet a hierarchically organized four-dimensional spectrum from consciousness to love and the divine. So on the left side, you have a diagram with different types of consciousness. And on the right side, you have a simplified diagram of how the brain of a meditative person looks like, okay? And plenty of studies here. I mentioned the one by Mario Beauregard in Montreal. Fantastic in neuroscience research. In these colors, it's an oversimplified image here, but it does a good job to give some example. Okay, so what type of meditation are we talking about it? Because at the beginning of this lecture, I put everything in the same basket, if you remember, okay? What did I say? I said that there are different experiences, and the brain works differently during prayer, meditation, and transcendental experiences. So that's very vague, you know? It's not true that prayer, meditation, and any type of transcendental experience is exactly the same thing. So the brain does react differently, okay? More specifically, if you see in purple or fuchsia on the left hemisphere, SX for sinistro, right? That's the part of the brain that's activated during mantra repetition, where the content itself, it's not that it doesn't fully matter, but it's a repetition, okay? You see that in many meditative practice, the Sanskrit Aum, for instance, right? Hare Krishna, or to get closer to you, think of the hesychasm in Orthodox Christianity, okay, Greek Orthodox Christianity, for instance, okay, where you repeat a word over and over again, okay. It can also be physical, okay, this kind of smooth wave, almost like lullaby-like going back and forth that many tradition within the Judeo-Christian and Islamic prayer have. Think about the Wailing Wall, for instance, in Jerusalem, okay. This is also be viewed as a mantra, something repetition. So that is the part of the brain is activated. You might not be surprised here because it's the left hemisphere after all, okay? And if you remember what we said about the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area, it makes total sense for a mantra that's word-based to be based on that, okay? In the back, you have visualizzazioni, or either visualization, visual imagery, guided imagery, okay? Which is closer to the occipital lobe, makes total sense. Autodissoluzione, self-dissolution, when you remove yourself, kind of Buddhist, Zen Buddhist practice, or even Catholic practice, when you detach yourself from the body, and it makes sense that you're going closer to the frontal lobes, this time on the right hemisphere, the same as the right hemisphere is where the auto-ricostruzione, auto-rebuilding, self-rebuilding, self-reconstruction starts, and then continues on the left. Why? Because in both cases, you're talking about imaging, okay? So the right hemisphere is more activated, but then because you're rebuilding, reassessing, remorphing, reestablishing connection, reintegrating, you're disintegrating, you're integrated, then you cross over the midline, you cross over the corpus callosum, and you reach the left hemisphere. See, this is your brain on prayer. This is your brain on guided imagery. This is your brain on meditation. Fascinating, and ultimately, even more important, this is really the truth. So, and on the right side, continuum dello stato di vigilanza, this continuum of the awareness state. Okay. On top, you have hypervigilanza, hypervigilance. On the bottom, ipovigilanza, which is hypovigilance, or inconscienza, when you're not conscious at all. So you're overstimulated on top, and that's where you see the overstimulated on the left side. Okay, dolore, pain. You see things such as mania, schizophrenia, paura, rabbia, fear, anger, ansia, anxiety. And on the right side, you have the hedonic element, pleasure, piacere, where you find orgasmo, ecstasy, ecstatic state, ecstasy, euphoria, excitation. So you on top, you go to hyper consciousness, extreme consciousness, hyper vigilance that can go in both direction, the pleasure or the pain. Below, when your consciousness is decreased, okay, and this is not just I want to be clear here. This is not just a theoretical diagram, philosophically based. It's definitely consistent with everything within tradition, religion, and spirituality, but it's demonstrated scientifically speaking. Okay, so on the bottom, reaching lower level of consciousness. If you go toward the left side, so the bottom left quadrant, you see sonnolenza, so somnolence or sleepiness, tensione, tension, okay, because you're not fully conscious, you don't fully know what to do with it. Depression, which, as I mentioned multiple times, is not just mood, is as if this was not bad enough, but it's also your body getting less and less and less conscious, more and more achy, more and more letting go, and then coma, okay? Now, notice here that just as above, you have a line in between that separates, for instance, mild anxiety, mild fear to over mania or schizophrenia, and then milder excitation, euphoria for ecstatic thing. You also find the role of chemicals, stimulants, okay, amphetamines, okay? So that means that this can also be induced. And below, depressants, for instance, alcohol, okay? So the last one, the bottom right quadrant, rilassamento, relaxing, tranquillità, tranquility, pace oceanica, which is a oceanic peace. It's borrowing from mystical philosophy. And then son, of course, somnolence or sleep, okay? And then as an example, here you have marijuana toward the top. And keep in mind that cannabinoids have both this relaxing property as well as mild psychedelic properties, and then ketamine toward the bottom, which means this, that so in this connecting consciousness with neuroscience and love, you have shortcuts as well. After all, yes, consciousness is fully impacted by physical elements, by chemistry. So you can induce hypervigilance, you can induce ecstatic factors or mania with stimulants, except you don't have full control, first of all, and also experiential knowledge, mystical knowledge, philosophy, and common sense in the real sense of the term, the sensus communis, the sensus divinitatis. Shortcuts are extremely dangerous. There is a reason why you should experience orgasm after love, why you should experience connection with other human beings rather than selling yourself short, lowering your standard, throwing yourself to another person. Okay, there is a limit to say, I'm not moralizing one night stands, but if you could have both orgasm, respect, and love, why would you pick something less for yourself? Don't throw yourself out. That's how you increase consciousness. You magnify love. You start to love yourself more. You start to be, sure, more picky, perhaps more demanding, but because you're worthy, because you are a really, in this sense, a divine being too. Okay, you're achieving, you're getting close to this divine discovery, and therefore shortcuts are not good. We're not here to moralizing. We're not here to point fingers. We're not to say you did this right or wrong, but any type of shortcut will come with some element of side effects. So in the context of hypervigilance, even a coffee is a stimulant. So we're not here to say you should not drink coffee because it's cheating. You're getting hypervigilant by cheating. You should really achieve that by meditating on your knowledge. Of course not. But if you overdo it, then you might become what? Anxious, jittery, and you obtain the opposite effect, okay? And in this sense, there's a hierarchical organization, okay? But if you are taking cocaine, for instance, to perform better, then with great power comes greater responsibility, neurochemically speaking. The opposite is true as well for relaxing. Okay, if you need to take an antidepressant, of course, as long as this is connected to being monitored by a professional, this is good and can help you. But if you're drinking yourself to sleep every night, this type of shortcut will come with extreme side effect and eventually will become dangerous for your developing a sense of self and your consciousness. The same thing with love. Yes, we need to be open up in your heart to this manifestation, okay, to this providential love, okay. We should not be cocooned and restricting love, especially if we've been hurt, but not too open when we throw ourselves to anything comes to us, okay? Rather than falling in love, being active in love toward ourselves and to our fellow human beings.
So again, there's a continuum and yet a hierarchical, organized, four-dimensional spectrum from consciousness to love and the divine. This, I hope, is something that we can all relate to. This lecture is by no means the end solution to the mind-body problem or to the hard or soft problem of consciousness, but at the very least, I hope I stimulated your brain, your heart, perhaps even your soul enough to be curious about how all of this really has a profound impact on everybody's life. Thank you very much for your attention to lecture number 7. All the slides will be available to currently enrolled students on the module, so feel free to take a look and review the materials. I'm always here if you have any questions. Congratulations again in reaching the midterm mark, and I will see you all in week 8. Bye-bye.